Welcome back to The Heat as we continue to discuss the U.S. criminal justice system and calls to reform it. With me, Joan Petersilia, co-director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center. From Nashville, Tennessee, Alex Friedmann, a former inmate in the American prison system. And here in Washington, D.C., Grover Norquist, one of the leading conservative voices in the United States. Let's continue with this discussion. Alex, I want to start with you again this time. What kind of role do you think the for-profit privatization of prisons plays in the fact that there's such a high prison population in the United States?
I believe it's an effect and not a cause of mass incarceration. The private prison industry began in the 1980s really to fulfill a market niche that was created due to the ramping up or the escalation of our prison population. So as we put more people in prison under the mandatory minimum sentences and much harsher and tough on crime sentencing laws, such as truth in sentencing and 3 strikes, that created a need for more prison beds. So companies such as Corrections Corporation of America or Wackenhut Corrections, now known as GEO Group, were formed really to meet that market need and to capitalize on the demand for prison beds. So it's not so much that the private prison industry drove mass incarceration in the United States, it's more the other way around. That being said, for the last 30 years that we've had private prisons, so long as for-profit prison companies can provide that extra bed space that state and federal and local governments need, those government agencies have not had to ask those hard questions to reform their sentencing laws or their parole policies or to take a hard look at who they're putting in prison for what reasons and for how long. As long as they can simply contract out with a private company to incarcerate prisoners, they did not have to ask those difficult questions or make those difficult choices. So the private prison industry has basically stymied criminal justice reform in the United States for a number of decades.
Joan, let me get your views on that. Do you think that, the private prison industry, I mean, they have to have certain occupancy rates to make a profit. So in that respect, are they pushing for more prisoners to be in there?
Well, I think Alex is right on, and he's absolutely right that they didn't get us to the place where we are right now, but they're a formidable foe going forward to reform. So they are now in place. About 6 to 8% of all prisoners in the United States are held in private prisons. Here in California, we are doing exactly what Alex suggested. We are actually purchasing beds in 3 other states to allow us to keep our prison population to a court-ordered cap. If we didn't have that court-ordered, that extra space, we would actually be having to have a different conversation about sentencing reform here in California. But I think also more importantly about what the private prisons can do is they can advertise, they can grow the fear level among constituents, they can invest money into elections that tend to get elected very tough on crime individuals. So I think that they didn't cause the problem we are in, but their vast amounts of money will allow us to have a very hard time moving out of the prison industrial complex, as it's often referred to.
Grover, what's your view? Should incarceration be a business?
Well, in terms of if you can contract something out, I mean, the point here is if you have a public sector unionized prison guard system, last time I checked about 300,000 people in the United States worked in that industry with government guarantees, you can't fire them, ridiculous pensions, ridiculous benefits, ridiculous work rules. That's why they're so much more expensive than private prisons. And a private prison contract is up every few years. I mean, we don't like you, we don't need you, you can go. It's much easier to bring those numbers down. Try firing, prison guards in California. The idea that for-profit prison companies are political players on the size, I mean, I used to work in California politics. The prison guard union made and broke candidates. I've never heard anyone suggest that Wackenhut had a similar situation. They were and are a terribly strong power who have opposed the sorts of reforms that would allow more flexibility because you can't downsize state-run. Tried downsizing the post office. UPS can downsize, FedEx can downsize, the post office can't in the same time frame and with the same ease. So there's a lot more flexibility when you have independent companies because you can let them go. You can tell them we're not going to pay as much. You can't do that with public sector unions with gold-plated contracts.
I get the point that it blocks criminal justice reform, but if the motive is profit all the time, then should we get rid of private prisons, make it all public, so that there can be reform of the criminal justice system?
Okay. Demanding gold-plated pensions and make work rules is much more expensive than the profit that a for-profit company gets, which actually costs less. So when the government employees are not disinterested, they have a profit motive. They just take their profits in very expensive pensions that nobody else gets to see, benefit packages no other American gets to see, and pay and work rules that other people don't get the benefit of. So it's much less flexible, much more expensive, and there are lots of reasons to downsize prisons and the number of people we incarcerate. But the idea that for-profit guys that take up some of the slack at one end are driving it, I think is counterfactual.
Alex, this is a hot-button issue right now. I mean, there is bipartisan support for it in Congress as well. Give me your best-case scenario of what you'd realistically like to see, or what could be realistically achieved in the short term as far as prison reform is concerned.
Well, as Joan mentioned, really, criminal justice reform on the broad scale is a state-by-state issue. The federal government can only do so much. It can reform sentencing laws for federal crimes. It can deal with issues involving overcrowding in the federal system and so on. But really, each state is going to have to take a hard look at their own criminal justice systems. And a number of states have been doing that. Since the economic downturn starting in 2008, a number of states are revising their sentencing laws and lessening the sentencing penalties for certain crimes. They are letting more people out either on early release or on the back end of their sentences via parole. And they are investing more in justice reform and alternatives to incarceration. There are a broad range of alternatives to incarceration, ranging anywhere from community work service to shock incarceration or day fines or probation or GPS monitoring and so on. We just don't tend to use a lot of those sanctions because the criminal justice system in the United States is very punitive. We have a very punitive mindset, and we don't think people are really being punished unless we're locking them in a little cell. So on the state level, that's really where the fight is. I certainly think Congress can make additional changes to mandatory minimum laws.
Okay.
I think they can make changes in terms of who is going into federal prison systems. But ultimately, this is a state-by-state fight.
All right, Alex, I'm going to get a quick word in from Joan. Joan, do we know if there's broad public support for reform in the prison system?
You know, I think there is right now because of the downswing in the economy. And I think the real challenge is going to be when the economy recovers, are we still of the mood to downsize prisons? And I think what will keep us in the mood is if we really have evidence that these alternatives to prison have actually worked to both reduce recidivism, save money, and don't forget to honor kind of serious crime victims.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. We would love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. Once again, that's theheat@cctv-america.com. I'm Anand, Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.